This is a true horror story about a deeply unsettling real experience that fundamentally shattered my sense of security, a scary story that still makes me completely freeze whenever the house settles at night. I grew up in a sprawling, slightly outdated, single-story craftsman house that my parents built themselves in the deeply isolated, heavily wooded rural outskirts of the Pacific Northwest, a place where the winters are incredibly harsh and profoundly silent. Living in an old family house for your entire life means you intimately know absolutely every single microscopic sound it makes. I know exactly which wooden floorboards creak, the familiar, low hum of the basement furnace, and the way the heavy roof settles under the massive weight of a winter snowfall. Every single noise normally has a perfectly logical, earthly explanation, making the isolated house feel like a deeply comforting, impenetrable sanctuary against the freezing, chaotic world outside. It was a bitterly cold, completely windless Tuesday night in the absolute middle of January, the ambient temperature having aggressively plummeted significantly below freezing, leaving a thick, glittering layer of heavy, pristine white snow completely blanketing the expansive front yard. I was sitting comfortably in my warm, heavily insulated bedroom, scrolling mindlessly on my phone in the pitch-black darkness, entirely convinced that I was perfectly safe and entirely alone. But that's when things changed. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, pressurized silence of the sleeping house was abruptly, deliberately broken by a sound that instantly paralyzed my freezing lungs. It was a soft, methodical knock coming directly from the heavy oak front door at the end of the long central hallway. It was absolutely not an aggressive, frantic pounding of a desperate person needing immediate help, nor was it loud enough to wake the distant neighbors. It was just a calm, incredibly polite, highly deliberate series of 3 slow taps. I sat perfectly, rigidly still in the dark, my frantically beating heart hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird. I couldn't explain it. There was absolutely no logical reason for anyone to be standing on my isolated front porch in the absolute dead of a freezing winter night. I slowly, agonizingly pushed myself out of my warm bed, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing hardwood floorboards, and silently crept down the dark, heavily shadowed corridor. I carefully, breathlessly peeled back a tiny corner of the heavy living room curtains and peered intently through the frosted front window, fully expecting to see a stranded motorist or a lost delivery driver standing in the pale moonlight. But the sprawling, freezing front yard was completely, flawlessly empty. The thick, pristine blanket of white snow completely covering the long driveway and the concrete porch steps was perfectly, beautifully untouched, entirely lacking any heavy, dragging footprints or chaotic signs of a physical approach. There was absolutely no one standing outside in the bitter cold. I desperately, pathetically tried to rationally explain the terrifying anomaly away using cold, hard, desperate logic, forcefully convincing my rapidly fracturing mind that the polite knocking was simply a bizarre acoustic illusion caused by the freezing winter wind violently rattling a loose piece of wooden siding against the heavy doorframe. I let out a long, exhausted, violently trembling sigh of pure, manufactured relief and slowly walked entirely back to my dark bedroom, desperately wanting to believe that the secure walls of my house were still impenetrable. But something felt fundamentally, impossibly wrong about the stagnant, freezing indoor air violently pressing against my exposed neck. I climbed back under my heavy quilts, staring intensely at the dark plaster ceiling, when exactly 1 agonizing minute later, the exact same calm, polite, methodical knock echoed clearly through the dead, static silence. Before my screaming, ancient primal survival instincts could violently demand that I run blindly out of the room, my mobile phone suddenly vibrated sharply against the hard surface of my wooden nightstand, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my pale, sweating face. It was a brief text message from my closest neighbor. An older man who lived in the only other isolated property on the dead-end dirt road, his house situated about 50 yards away through the dense pine trees. The bright message glowed harshly in the dark room, simply reading, "Did you hear that too?" I swallowed the hard, dry lump of pure, unadulterated terror wedged deeply in my freezing throat and frantically typed back, "The knocking." I sat perfectly still, the heavy, suffocating barometric pressure of the room actively squeezing the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping chest as I watched the small, bouncing digital bubbles indicating his reply. His response violently slammed into my fragile sanity like a heavy iron sledgehammer, instantly and permanently destroying the final, clinging remnants of my rational mind. He responded, "There was only one knock before you answered." A massive, freezing shockwave of highly toxic adrenaline violently tore straight down my rigid spine, instantly turning the tense muscles in my trembling legs into heavy, unyielding solid stone. I absolutely had not answered the door, and I definitely had not knocked back. The deeply terrifying, mind-breaking realization that whatever had produced the second series of calm, polite taps was absolutely not standing outside in the freezing yard, but was already physically occupying the dark, empty space inside my locked home, completely and entirely paralyzed me. The true horror story rapidly escalated as the heavily pressurized, static silence of the isolated house abruptly transformed into a massive, heavy, highly predatory void. I was completely trapped in a waking, suffocating nightmare, entirely isolated from the rest of the natural, breathing world, the heavy, pitch-black darkness pooling densely in the corners of my bedroom feeling impossibly dense and highly malevolent. Every single microscopic, subtle, impossible detail of the silent environment aggressively attacked my exhausted, panicked brain. The air felt unnaturally stale, the ambient temperature plummeted to a bitter, biting chill, and the profound sensation of being intensely, meticulously watched from the deep shadows violently anchored my heavy body to the mattress. I absolutely did not dare to move a single, violently aching muscle, entirely terrified to draw a single, natural breath or even blink my dry, burning eyes, completely waiting for the ancient, unseen entity to physically manifest. And then, the ultimate, mind-shattering final escalation violently occurred. The third and final knock did not come from the heavy front door down the long hallway, and it absolutely did not come from the distant kitchen or the empty living room. 3 slow, calm, incredibly polite taps echoed deafeningly loud right beside my rigid, sweating head. The sound came directly from the solid plaster wall located mere microscopic inches from the very edge of my heavy wooden bed. It was inside the room with me. The profound, crushing psychological pressure of knowing that an impossible, massive, dark anomaly was hovering silently and patiently right beside my completely vulnerable, exposed body was immense, actively freezing the warm blood circulating in my tired veins. I became entirely, completely too terrified to move, my pale lips clamped tightly shut as I lay perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing dark for the entire remainder of the agonizing, endless night, listening intently to the dead, heavy silence until the pale, gray light of the winter morning finally, mercifully broke through the drawn blinds. When the sun had fully risen, entirely washing away the heavy, suffocating shadows, I slowly, carefully forced myself to sit up, my entire body violently trembling with severe physical exhaustion and pure, lingering terror. My phone buzzed again. It was another message from my neighbor, asking with a tone of casual, mundane curiosity, "Why did you knock back last night?" I stared blankly at the glowing screen, my rapidly fracturing mind completely failing to process the impossible, terrifying reality. I never knocked. I slowly, agonizingly turned my terrified gaze to the smooth, pale plaster wall directly beside my heavy bed, exactly where the terrifying, close-range taps had originated just hours before. The horrific, impossible truth permanently poisoned my existence, leaving me entirely trapped in a waking paranoia that entirely overwrites my foundational understanding of the physical world. Pressed deeply and clearly into the thin layer of fine household dust coating the pale wall, perfectly positioned right at the exact height of a standing human being, were distinct, dark, unmistakable human fingerprints. They were small, deliberate, and perfectly spaced, exactly matching the 3 slow, polite taps that had violently haunted the dark room. If everyone heard the first knock echoing from the front porch, then who created the second one? This is a true horror story about a midnight knock that completely destroyed my understanding of reality, and to this day, it remains the most deeply unsettling real experience of my entire life. Most people casually search for a fictional scary story to experience a brief, highly entertaining thrill before safely drifting off to a peaceful sleep, completely secure in the undeniable belief that their heavy brass locks and drawn curtains provide an absolute, impenetrable physical barrier against the unpredictable, dark chaos of the outside world. But when the supposed safety of your private sanctuary is inexplicably and silently breached, it transforms into a terrifying real experience that permanently and violently shatters your core, foundational understanding of the physical world. I was sitting entirely alone in my childhood home, a sprawling, slightly outdated, single-story craftsman house located in a deeply isolated, heavily wooded suburban cul-de-sac. Living in your childhood home means you meticulously map out the acoustic blueprint of the structure completely in your subconscious. I knew exactly how the heavy wooden floorboards naturally creaked as the indoor temperature dropped, and I perfectly understood the deep, mechanical hum of the basement furnace heavily pushing warm air through the metal floor vents. The ambient temperature outside had aggressively and rapidly plummeted significantly below freezing just after dusk, leaving a thick, glittering layer of heavy white frost completely coating the dying grass of the expansive front lawn and trapping the isolated property in a dead, heavy, suffocating winter silence. The living room was completely unlit, entirely swallowed by a thick blanket of absolute, impenetrable darkness, leaving the harsh, piercing, pale blue light from my mobile phone screen as the only fragile oasis of illumination in the freezing void. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, pressurized silence of the house was abruptly and jarredly interrupted. It was the first midnight knock. Just 3 soft, highly deliberate, incredibly gentle taps echoing clearly against the heavy oak wood of the front door. The sound was completely normal, exactly like a close friend politely asking to be let inside from the freezing cold. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather recliner, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing hardwood floorboards, and walked meticulously down the dark central hallway to check the small, circular glass peephole. The pitch-black porch outside was completely empty. I forcefully turned the heavy brass deadbolt, aggressively pulled the solid oak door open, and stepped out into the bitter, biting winter chill. The sprawling, frozen front yard was perfectly, beautifully undisturbed under the pale, sickly moonlight. The thick layer of glittering winter snow completely coating the wooden porch steps was perfectly pristine and entirely untouched. There were absolutely no heavy, dragging footprints leading up to my front door, and absolutely no footprints leading away into the dense, dark line of ancient pine trees bordering the property. I actively tried to convince my rapidly fracturing mind that I had simply heard the heavy winter wind violently rattling a loose shutter or a frozen tree branch aggressively striking the siding of the house. I firmly closed the door, securely engaging every single heavy lock, and retreated completely back to my chair in the dark living room. But something felt wrong. A profound, creeping, ice-cold dread began to pool heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach, entirely paralyzing my freezing lungs. The natural, comforting, ambient background noises of my familiar childhood home slowly, methodically began to completely, inexplicably fade away into absolute nothingness, plunging the sprawling property into a deafening, heavy, static void of absolute silence. Exactly 15 agonizing, heavily pressurized minutes later, the second midnight knock violently shattered the quiet room. It was the exact same rhythm. 3 identical, soft, highly deliberate, gentle taps. Before I could even move a single, violently aching muscle, my mobile phone briefly illuminated my pale, sweating face with a harsh glare, vibrating aggressively against the armrest. It was a text message from my nearest neighbor, an older man who lived over 100 yards away through the dense, freezing pine woods. The short, incredibly brief message simply read, "Did someone just knock at your door too?" I frantically, aggressively typed back with my clammy, violently shaking thumb, "Yeah, twice. Someone is out there." I sat perfectly, rigidly still, watching the 3 small, glowing digital dots silently jump on the screen as he prepared his response. When his reply finally appeared in the harsh blue light, it violently anchored my heavy body to the chair and instantly froze the hot blood in my tired veins. The message read, "Twice. I only heard one." That's when I noticed it. A chaotic storm of pure, unadulterated primal terror violently flooded my completely exhausted, sleep-deprived brain. If my neighbor had undeniably heard the knock from over 100 yards away, completely through his heavily insulated walls and the thick, sound-dampening winter woods, it must have been a deafening, massive, booming impact outside. But to my biological ears, standing just feet away from the heavy oak entrance, it had sounded incredibly soft, exactly like gentle knuckles lightly tapping directly against the wood. And if he had undeniably only heard the first, massive knock echoing through the cold valley, where exactly did the second midnight knock come from? The deeply sickening, impossible realization instantly and violently paralyzed my freezing legs. The acoustic resonance of the second sound had been completely, fundamentally different. It hadn't come from the heavy front door at all. It had echoed distinctly, clearly, and highly unnaturally from deep inside the physical architecture of my own house. I slowly, meticulously backed entirely away from the open living room, silently creeping down the pitch-black central corridor until I reached my master bedroom, firmly locking the heavy wooden door completely behind me and retreating entirely into the absolute dark. I collapsed heavily onto my mattress, pulling the thick quilts up to my trembling chin, entirely consumed by the suffocating, intensely invasive feeling of being actively, highly malevolently watched by an unseen, ancient presence. The silence inside the locked bedroom felt incredibly heavy, a dense, oppressive, highly unnatural static void that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping chest. I couldn't explain it. There was absolutely no logical, earthly reason for the massive, freezing spike of primal anxiety violently washing over my body, but my deep, ancient survival instincts violently screamed that I was completely, helplessly trapped in a waking nightmare. I lay perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing dark for 2 agonizing, endless hours, completely terrified to move a single muscle, entirely desperate to hear the incredibly faint, microscopic sound of a floorboard creaking or a physical footstep to completely ground my panic in earthly reality. But the house remained flawlessly, perfectly silent. And then, at exactly 4 a.m., the final midnight knock occurred. It absolutely did not come from the heavy front door, and it did not echo from the dark central hallway outside my bedroom. Directly beside my freezing, exposed right ear, separated only by a thin, fragile layer of drywall and peeling paint, 3 soft, gentle, highly deliberate taps vibrated clearly and terrifyingly through the actual wall of my bedroom. Tap. 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 It was coming entirely, undeniably from inside the hollow, pitch-black space exactly between the wooden wall studs, directly level with my resting head. The entity wasn't trying to physically break into my isolated sanctuary, it was already intimately, silently inside the very bones of the house, actively mocking my fragile, pathetic illusion of absolute safety. I didn't scream, and I didn't violently jump out of bed. I simply lay there in pure, blinding terror, completely paralyzed by the massive, freezing psychological pressure violently radiating directly out of the dark plaster, entirely unwilling to answer the impossible summons. I remained perfectly, statue-like still until the pale, cold, gray light of the winter morning finally, slowly crept through the horizontal window blinds, entirely washing away the heavy, suffocating darkness that had invaded my home. When I finally found the desperate, physical courage to slowly sit up on the mattress and meticulously examine the blank, pale bedroom wall where the terrifying sounds had logically originated, the absolute final, mind-shattering twist violently destroyed the last remaining, clinging fragments of my sanity. In the exact, specific spot right next to my pillows where I had undeniably heard the gentle tapping, the smooth, flat surface of the painted drywall was subtly, terrifyingly deformed. Pressed perfectly and flawlessly into the solid plaster, pushing aggressively and violently outward into my room from the hollow, pitch-black, suffocating space deep inside the wall itself, were the distinct, unmistakable, highly detailed physical impressions of impossibly long, emaciated human fingerprints. Something incredibly tall, impossibly patient, and entirely unknown had been silently standing perfectly still entirely inside the narrow, freezing architecture of my childhood home all night long, gently tapping on the fragile barrier separating us in the dark. This is a true horror story that actively and permanently poisons every single quiet moment of my existence, proving completely that the ancient things hunting in the dark don't always wait outside your locked doors. Some stories do not end when the morning sun finally rises, and some midnight knocks are just patiently, eternally waiting for you to finally gather the courage to answer. This is a true horror story about a midnight knock that completely shattered my understanding of safety, a profoundly terrifying real experience that happened to me just last winter. Most people enjoy listening to a scary story while wrapped in a warm blanket, completely secure in the belief that the locked doors of their home provide an absolute, impenetrable barrier against the dark, unpredictable chaos of the outside world, but when that barrier is inexplicably breached without a single sound, the resulting psychological dread permanently poisons your existence. I live entirely alone in a deeply isolated suburban neighborhood, residing in a sprawling, slightly outdated family home built several decades ago, located at the very absolute end of a quiet, dead-end street. Last January, a massive, unprecedented winter storm aggressively rolled through the area, heavily blanketing the entire neighborhood in several feet of thick, undisturbed snow and plunging the entire property into a heavy, suffocating, pitch-black darkness the exact moment the sun set. The heavy snow actively swallowed any ambient noise from the distant highway, leaving the house completely wrapped in a deafening, heavily pressurized, absolute silence. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was lying perfectly still in my warm bed, entirely unable to sleep, just listening intensely to the dead, static quiet of the freezing night. And then, completely shattering the heavy silence, a sound echoed from the front of the house. It was a knock. It wasn't the frantic, aggressive pounding of someone desperately needing help or the chaotic, heavy thud of falling winter debris. It was a slow, incredibly polite, highly deliberate knock coming directly from the heavy wooden front door. I slowly pushed the heavy blankets completely off my chest, my bare feet sinking painfully into the freezing hardwood floorboards as I quietly crept down the long, pitch-black central hallway, my rapid, terrified breath forming thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation in the freezing indoor air. I carefully pressed my pale, sweating face directly against the freezing glass of the front window, fully expecting to see a stranded motorist or a wandering neighbor, but the glowing, pale light of the street lamp revealed absolutely nothing. The sprawling front porch was completely empty, and the thick, heavy layer of glittering white snow covering the entire front yard was perfectly, flawlessly undisturbed, entirely lacking a single set of physical footprints. I desperately tried to convince my rapidly fracturing mind that it was simply the old, wooden house naturally settling in the extreme, freezing temperatures, aggressively explaining the impossible anomaly away using cold, hard, desperate logic. But something felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact, highly specific way the stagnant air suddenly felt actively pressing heavily against my exposed skin. That's when I noticed it. As I stood perfectly, rigidly still in the dark foyer, a second, completely identical knock violently echoed through the freezing air. It possessed the exact same deliberate, polite, highly calculated rhythm as the first, but before my panicked brain could fully process the impossible sound, my mobile phone abruptly buzzed inside my pocket, the harsh, pale blue light sharply illuminating my terrified face in the pitch-black darkness. It was a text message from my next-door neighbor, an older man whose bedroom window directly faces my front porch. The message simply read, "Did you hear it too?" I quickly typed back with trembling fingers, my heart hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped bird, entirely relieved that I wasn't just experiencing a severe, sleep-deprived hallucination. I replied, "Yeah, I heard 2 knocks. Did you see anyone outside?" I watched the small, digital typing bubble hover on the glowing screen for several agonizing, heavily pressurized seconds before his response finally appeared, sending a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread tearing straight down my rigid spine. His message read, "2. No, I only heard 1 knock from outside, and then I heard someone inside your house knock back." I completely stopped breathing, the suffocating, toxic realization violently anchoring my freezing feet to the floorboards. I was completely, undeniably alone in the isolated house, and I had absolutely not moved a single muscle or made a single, microscopic sound to respond to the visitor. The silence of the house suddenly felt incredibly, impossibly heavy, actively transforming from a peaceful quiet into a dense, oppressive, predatory void that aggressively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs. I slowly, agonizingly backed away from the front door, my wide, unblinking eyes desperately scanning the heavy, pitch-black shadows pooling deeply in the corners of the living room, completely terrified that the massive, unseen entity was patiently standing just inches out of my sight. I retreated entirely back into my master bedroom, quietly locking the heavy wooden door behind me and crawling slowly into the center of my bed, entirely consumed by a raw, screaming, animalistic fear that completely saturated my fragile soul. I lay perfectly still in the freezing dark, staring intensely at the ceiling, listening to the deafening, heavy static of the house, desperately praying that the entire terrifying real experience was simply over. No sound. No movement. Nothing. But I couldn't explain it. The intense, overwhelming psychological pressure violently radiating in the room suddenly spiked to an unbearable, highly toxic degree. And then, the final knock happened. It absolutely did not come from the heavy front door, and it did not echo from down the dark, isolated hallway. It happened directly, intimately beside my bed, tapping politely and deliberately against the interior drywall mere microscopic inches away from my exposed, trembling head. It was not loud. It was just close. Far, far too close. I sat completely frozen, my entire body violently shaking with toxic adrenaline, absolutely refusing to look over the edge of the mattress into the dark shadows pooling on the floor, listening intensely to the complete, heavy, unnatural silence that permanently followed. I stayed trapped in that rigid, terrifying paralysis until the pale, gray light of the morning sun finally broke through the winter clouds, completely illuminating the small, safe room. When I finally found the courage to speak with my neighbor later that bright, freezing morning, he adamantly, firmly swore that he had clearly heard a distinct, answering knock immediately originate entirely from within the walls of my home. I insisted, with a violently shaking voice, that I had never moved and had never made a sound. But when I finally returned to my bedroom to desperately search for a logical, earthly explanation, the final, completely mind-shattering proof aggressively revealed itself, permanently turning this into a true horror story that I will never escape. Located exactly on the pale drywall right directly beside my mattress, positioned mere inches above the dark floorboards where the terrifying sound had originated, were three long, smudged, highly unnatural, deeply elongated strange fingerprints pressed firmly into the dust. I never answered the midnight knock. But something already inside the house did.